What is happening, my Hork-Bajir, and welcome back to the channel. This is the second installment in my Tragedy of Tobias series where I summarize and analyze the early character arc of Tobias from the Animorphs books. If you haven't seen part 1, link is in the description. In the last episode of this 3-part series, we talked about Tobias' painful journey towards accepting his status as a Nothlit. A Nothlit is someone who's been trapped in Morph. And we covered the events of The Encounter, the third book in the series. In this episode, we'll be covering the events of The Change and the next big things in store for Tobias. The Change is the 13th book in the series, and a lot has happened since we last left off. I won't go too far into detail because I do have a lot of video ideas planned, especially for the early books, but here are a few noteworthy items that I think give a good idea of where we stand. In book 7, The Stranger, the Elemist gives the Animorphs the options to be transported to a distant planet light years away where the Yeerks won't be able to find them and they'll be able to repopulate the species. As a part of this deal, Tobias would get his human body back, but Tobias immediately refuses, saying that the Elemist is just using his friend's affection towards him as a tool. This is totally classic Tobias. Faced with the opportunity to get his human form back, and even a free pass out of the Yeerk fight, Tobias refuses on principle, just because it involves someone possibly pitying him or feeling bad for him or him being used in some way. In book 8, The Alien, Axe says, "Sometimes I think Tobias and I could be true Shorm. A Shorm is a deep friend, someone you never lie to, someone who knows all your secrets." I love Axe and Tobias' relationship and plan to dedicate at least one full video to it, but I thought that it was worth bringing up here just for context. Lastly, in book 9, The Secret, Cassie asks Tobias why he doesn't let them just bring food for him to eat so he doesn't have to hunt anymore. And Tobias says, "I'm not just a human, I'm also a hawk. Hawks hunt live prey. Would it be any better if I let you do my killing for me? Is it more moral if I eat a frozen mouse that you get from some supplier?" I always thought that this was a really clever reply to Cassie's usual moral agonizing, and it also signifies that Tobias has accepted his Nothlit status enough where he's able to think about it in a pretty cold and pragmatic way. So here's where we stand going into book 13. Tobias has accepted his hawk body, he's proven himself useful as the Animorphs Air Force in spite of his inability to morph, he's saved all the Animorphs' lives a number of times in the intervening books. He's comfortable enough filling the hawk's most basic needs, he's able to hunt now without it causing him too much stress. He still rejects all forms of pity, implied or otherwise, and he's got a nice fun bromance budding with Axe. My read on Tobias going into this book is that it's really important to him that the Animorphs believe that he has it all put together, and that he's at peace with his state, or at least as at peace as he's ever going to be. So the book kicks off with Tobias hunting. He catches a mouse and he's eating it when he notices a stray magazine on the ground, and it's flipped open to a page that shows just a human classroom, just a standard slice of life for a teenager in America. And as Tobias eats this mouse and he looks at it, he thinks about the human life that he left behind, but that isn't him anymore. Choosing to start the book like this is a way of showing how far Tobias has come. The idea of hunting used to repulse him, but now it's just a fact of life. More than that, like I mentioned before, he's now able to ruminate more deeply on the existential questions of who he is and what he is without it causing him as much visceral distress as it used to. So after he's eaten, Tobias flies to school thinking about all the good parts of being a bird. He spots Rachel leaving the school, and he notices that under her arm with all her books is a letter, and this is a letter from some National Honor Society type of thing. It's called the Packard Award for Academic Excellence, and Rachel's won it. He uses ThoughtSpeak to communicate with her, asking if she'd like to fly with him after school, and she agrees. Tobias states, "There are some nice things about being a hawk. Flying with Rachel is probably the nicest, but it would have been nice to see her get the Packard Award too." This brings us up to speed with where Tobias is mentally. He hunts, hawk life is good, and he gets to fly with Rachel, which is awesome. But there's this nagging pain attached to flying with Rachel especially that just always reminds him of what he can't have. This sets off a sequence of thoughts that brings us to the central question of this book. If the encounter asked what Tobias was and where he belonged as an extension of that, the change asks what Tobias wants. He is what he is, but what does he hope for? Now somewhat removed from the immediacy of the horror and angst he felt when he was trapped in a body that he didn't perceive as his own, Tobias is able to start thinking about these questions. Tobias asks himself, if I could never become Tobias the hawk, and only be Tobias the boy, would I? Right now, he doesn't have an answer. So we learn that Tobias has been spending his days following known controllers around in an attempt to find new entrances to the Yeerk pool. In explaining what the Yeerk pool is to the reader, Tobias states, "The Yeerk pool is where I lost my humanity." This is interesting because in many ways this is actually where Tobias was born. He was just saying that he doesn't know whether he would go back to his old human life if he had the choice, and now he's saying that the Yeerk pool is where he truly lost that old human life. So Rachel meets up with Tobias and they fly around while he debriefs her on his progress. He also congratulates her on winning the Packard Award, and she feels a little bit awkward about this and tells him that she only didn't tell him about it because she didn't want him to feel bad. And Tobias asks that in the future, she not keep things from him to preserve his feelings. The obsession with self-sufficiency that Tobias has seems to stem from a few things, in my opinion. The first would be the Hawk's predator instincts potentially overwhelming Tobias's natural temperament, but the second is that maybe Tobias is using the Hawk's nature as an excuse to lean into these defense mechanisms. And I think what we're seeing here is probably some combination of the two, but I tend to lean towards the latter. I do think that there's a lot of very deeply subconscious internal intent at play with Tobias, and we're going to discuss that a little more with some of the revelations that happen in the next book. So Tobias attempts to take Rachel to the town's car wash, where he thinks that a Yeerk pool entrance may be hidden. Tobias is usually an excellent navigator, but for some reason this time they wind up somewhere totally unintended, miles away from where they meant to be in a totally different part of town near the edge of the woods. A little unnerved by this, Tobias shakes himself off and they set off in the right direction, only to find themselves a few minutes later at this very same exact spot in the woods. Definitely shaken at this point, Tobias and Rachel are looking around and they see that there's a tree that appears like it's moving horizontally, like it's on tracks. And as they watch, a hole appears underneath this tree, and from the hole emerge two Hork-Bajir. They look visibly scared and they break into a sprint immediately. And shortly afterwards, about 30 humans come out, followed by a bunch of dirt bikes, and they give chase to these two Hork-Bajir. And Rachel and Tobias discuss this briefly, and they decide that regardless of what's going on, if these Hork-Bajir are running from the Yeerks, that Rachel and Tobias should help them. They use thought speak to communicate with the Hork-Bajir, and Tobias explains to the reader that this is kind of like email because you can address it to one person or to many people at the same time. Anyway, there's a pretty awesome chase scene through the forest where Tobias gets to show off what an expert flyer he's become, and ultimately the Hork-Bajir are separated, with one of them getting away with Rachel and Tobias and the other going in a different direction. They're not sure what's happened to the other Hork-Bajir. So Rachel and Tobias take the one freed Hork-Bajir and they flee to a nearby cave where Tobias thinks that they'll be safe enough, at least for the time being. The next day, the gang all convenes at Cassie's barn, which was definitely my literary home away from home, prior to Hogwarts at least, and Tobias and Rachel debrief them on the day's events. They agree that it seems likely that these two Hork-Bajir escaped and that they're actually not controllers at all, and that what they witnessed was a bunch of human controllers chasing them through the forest. They're deliberating what they should do when they realize that they haven't asked the one free Hork-Bajir what he wants to do, so they decide to go do that. The Hork-Bajir is named Jarahami, and he is not very articulate. He's in the middle of explaining that what he wants is to find his wife and to be free when Cassie lets them know that they've got a bunch of controllers in the woods heading towards them. They decide that the best way to handle this threat is to have someone morph Jarahami and run away, leading the Yeerks off the scent. This someone winds up being Rachel. Tobias decides that he's going to go along with her because he feels a little bit guilty because she has to morph and do this, and this was actually his idea, so he perches on her horns while she runs through the woods and the Yeerks chase her. And at one point she trips, and he's knocked off of her horns. And as he flutters back up to try to land back on her horns, he suddenly finds himself miles away in a totally different part of the forest. He immediately sees that Jarahami's wife is there, as is Visser 3 in human morph. And Visser 3 demorphs, and he's starting to get into this really great monologue, I'm sure, when Tobias acts. And what he does is he baits this other hawk that he knows lives in this meadow to come out. And once all of the Yeerks and Visser 3 see this other hawk, they're immediately distracted and they divert all of their attention towards it because they assume it's an Andalite bandit. And while they're all looking at this Andalite bandit, Tobias swoops in and he rakes Visser 3 across the stalk eyes, and he escapes with the other freed Hork-Bajir. Back at the cave, the two Hork-Bajir are reunited. We learn that the female Hork-Bajir is named Ket Halpak, and the Animorphs need to figure out their next move. They contemplate going to the media, but they decide against it because humans are just too violent and unpredictable. Suddenly, Tobias is struck with inspiration. He knows a place, a valley, that would be perfect for the free Hork-Bajir. It's secluded, it has fresh water, it's up in the mountains, and it would be really difficult for the Yeerks to find. The Animorphs resolve to take the Hork-Bajir there the next day, and after they leave, Tobias confides in the reader that he actually has no idea where these visions in his head came from, and he's never even been to this valley before. Tobias stays with the Hork-Bajir for the night, perched in a tree outside their cave keeping watch, and we get to see at this point some of the darker aspects of his hawk life. Tobias explains that he's used to sitting near the top of the food chain during the day, and he knows that he has the best eyes out there, and there aren't too many predators that will actually go after a hawk. At nighttime, though, that's entirely different. He's not really at the top of the food chain anymore, and he thinks about owls. And while he's not necessarily scared of owls, it seems like he is a little bit unnerved by what they represent, which is that he's not the biggest or the strongest predator out there. Humans are a unique style of apex predator, but hawks are just one of many predators in the forest. In this moment of vulnerability, Tobias actually admits to himself that it might be nice to have a human bed and a roof over his head. This is big for him. He's usually very averse to articulating his desire to be human again. He tries to remember what it's like to sleep in a bed, but he can't really picture it, and he finds he can only picture his Animorphs friends asleep in their beds. I think this demonstrates two things. The first is that Tobias is wistful about something that he really never had to begin with. And the second of which is that Tobias doesn't really want to be human again. I think that question is starting to be answered already. Tobias is deep in these thoughts when Axe shows up to check on him in the Hork-Bajir. Tobias has just asked Axe if random images suddenly appear in his head ever, when all of a sudden, a random image appears in his head, and it's of taxons crawling through the forest towards them. And Tobias tells Axe about this image, and Axe confirms that indeed there is a special type of taxon called tracker taxons that would be able to find these Hork-Bajir. They've got a great sense of smell, they can sense body heat, they'll be able to find the Hork-Bajir. So Tobias sends Axe to go get Jake and the others, and resolves to begin the journey up to the mountains in the meantime. He's disquieted as they start, feeling like someone's using him as a puppet, and we know that Tobias hates that. He says to himself, I was the predator, I was the hunter. No one was going to use me. Perched on Jarahami's horns for the journey, Tobias makes an offhand comment about the little voice in his head that he keeps hearing. Jarahami replies by telling Tobias that he too heard a voice. When he was in the Yeerk pool, after the Yeerk left his head, a voice popped into his head and it said, when I say you need to run, you need to take your wife, I'm going to send a guide. At this point, Tobias, likely suspecting who's behind this, stops the party in its tracks and says they're not going to go one step further until he gets some answers. And all of a sudden, he finds himself suspended in space. He hears this booming voice say, hello, Tobias, we meet again. And there's only one person that this can be, and that's the Elemist. Tobias looks down, and he can't really explain this, but he's somehow simultaneously a full human and a full bird and a hybrid of both of them, all wrapped up together at the same time. He looks up and he sees floating out of the mist the Elemist, and the Elemist has taken the form of a bird of prey this time. And Tobias tells the Elemist, you look different from last time I saw you, and the Elemist says that he likes to always appear as a form that's familiar to the people he's going to speak to. And Tobias says, well, you know that I'm human. The Elemist replies to this by saying that Tobias doesn't look human to him, and then he changes into a human-bird hybrid similar to what Tobias is. He confirms that he was the voice in Jarahami's head, he's the reason for all of the images that Tobias has been seeing. This entire situation is by his design. Tobias has some cynical words for him, and the Elemist tells Tobias that he is the point on which an entire timeline may turn. Tobias doesn't particularly care about this, and he tells the Elemist that if he wants Tobias to do something, he'd better be prepared to pay for the service. When the Elemist asks what Tobias wants, Tobias tells him that the Elemist already knows what he wants. The Elemist laughs at this, and he says to Tobias, yes, but do you know what you want? And if you get it, will you still know? And with that, Tobias is transported back to the forest. So there's a lot to unpack in this scene. The Elemist's initial shape was a raptor, which he stated was because he wanted to appear familiar to Tobias. When Tobias stated that he's actually a human, the Elemist instead turns into the same kind of bird-human hybrid that Tobias was, rejecting Tobias's claim of humanity. This symbolizes how far from humanity Tobias has actually come. Externally, he's fully hawk, and at heart, internally, he's kind of both. He's got the hawk instincts and the hawk mind, and the human instincts and the human mind. So there's a reality that exists where he's fully hawk, and there's a reality that exists where he's both hawk and human, but right now there is not a reality that exists wherein he is fully human. Tobias also never asks the Elemist to make him human again. He states that he wants payment, and then he never clarifies what that payment is, even when the Elemist specifically asks him to. Similarly, when he was unable to picture himself in a human bed, I think that this reveals that Tobias doesn't want to be permanently human, or at least not be human in body or have his old life back. Some theorize that Tobias intentionally trapped himself in bird morph back in the invasion. I don't subscribe to this theory directly, but I do think that in this case, Tobias was intentionally vague with the Elemist because he doesn't want to be human again. Back in the forest, Tobias continues his journey with the renegade Hork-Bajir, and he finds out that their diet consists entirely of bark, and that this is the reason for their heavily bladed appearance. The blades aren't for combat at all, they're simply a tool for the Hork-Bajir to feed themselves, and they're not even predators. Needing to go hunt himself, Tobias finds that he's feeling a little bit guilty about this, and I think it's noteworthy that he never feels this way in front of his human friends. As Tobias flies off to hunt, he comes upon a meadow, noting that it's likely the territory of another animal, and resolving to make this a quick kill. Unfortunately, he botches the kill, and is immediately swatted to the ground by a bobcat that he didn't see. On the ground, looking up at this bobcat, he knows he's in trouble, and his hawk instincts are screaming at him to fly away. But Tobias knows that this bobcat's much faster than him on the ground, and it's gonna take him a second to get up in the air. So he knows as soon as he moves, this bobcat's gonna be on him. So he rejects his hawk instincts, and instead he leans into his human cunning to help him escape. And he grabs a sharp stick that's on the ground, and he holds it, and he waits for the bobcat to make the first move. And when the bobcat attacks him, Tobias twists the stick up and manages to get the bobcat right in the eye. And as the bobcat's distracted by this pain, Tobias is able to take the time he needs to get airborne and get away from that situation. I think this is a substantial contrast from the encounter when Tobias was trapped in the mall in extreme distress and in some physical danger. He chose to allow the hawk instincts to take over, knowing that it would likely mean injury or death when the hawk tried to fly through the ceiling. Now, in similar danger, he's suppressing his hawk instincts and he leans into his human instincts to get him out of trouble. Granted, he is motivated by more than self-preservation right now. He's got the lives of these two Hork-Bajir on the line. But I think that this falls in line with Tobias's other revelation from the end of the encounter, which is that if he can help others get their autonomy back, their humanity back, then maybe it'll help him stay human enough. And granted, the Hork-Bajir aren't humans, but I think this counts. So as he flies away, Tobias runs into Jake, who lets him know that the others are also there in Morph. Reunited, Tobias tells them about his encounter with the Elemist. Tobias then says to himself, "I thought of the Elemist's promise to me, to give me what I most wanted, but I recalled the conversation and I couldn't remember an actual promise. I felt a chill in my bones. Had the Elemist actually promised to make me human again?" We'll recall that the Elemist did not promise to make him human again. I'm surprised Tobias doesn't remember this, but I suspect in truth he probably does. It seems like Tobias's subconscious is a little bit ahead of the game here, and that he may be deceiving himself to a degree. The Elemist, in fact, questioned what Tobias's heart's desire truly was, and Tobias was unable to answer that question. Anger-tinged doubt at the Elemist seems like a defense mechanism here. The gang returns to Jarahami and Kethalpak, deliberating among themselves over whether or not they should reveal their human forms to them. After some chanting of "free or die," the Animorphs are convinced of the Hork-Bajir's conviction and demorph in front of them. With everyone in their true bodies now, they continue up the mountain. Tobias still hasn't eaten and decides to go hunt. He flies a distance away, and as he's hunting, he hears some helicopters. Since the gang are all in their human and Andalite forms, there's no way that they're going to be able to see or hear these helicopters before it's too late. Tobias realizes he has to race back and warn them, and as he zooms through the woods, he crashes into a tree, breaking his wing. As Tobias cowers on the ground, helpless and stranded, a raccoon approaches. And Tobias knows beyond certainty that this raccoon is going to be his death. The raccoon is cleaning him off prior to eating, which is what raccoons do, when Tobias hears the Elemist's voice in his head. The Elemist asks if Tobias would like his payment now, and Tobias says that now would be a really great time. The Elemist tells him it is done, and Tobias points out that he's still a bird. And the Elemist says, of course, the Andalite gave you a power, use it. Tobias has a little bit of an internal freakout because of this, but he acquires and morphs the raccoon nonetheless. He runs along the forest floor for a few minutes before realizing that he can morph back into his bird body, and since his DNA is still intact, his broken wing will be healed and he'll be able to fly back to the others. So this is a really big deal, and the first time that I read it, I found it to be truly epic. As a reader, I never wanted Tobias to be human again, so when he got back his morphing powers, I was enthralled that he'd be able to fully participate in all of the missions, be a full Animorph, while still being the cool, unique hawk boy that I'd grown to love at that point. I also like that when Tobias says, "but I'm still a bird" to the Elemist, he says, of course, like it should be obvious to him. It seems like to the Elemist, Tobias's heart's desire was pretty apparent. So Tobias flies back to the gang, noticing that the Yeerks have also started a forest fire at this point. And the Animorphs assess their situation. They've got a line of Yeerks behind them and a fire in front of them. The Yeerks are pulling out all the stops here, and they seem fully willing to risk exposure in order to catch these two Hork-Bajir. Tobias has an idea. If the Yeerks won't stop until the free Hork-Bajir are dead, then maybe they can use the morphing ability to trick the Yeerks into thinking that the Hork-Bajir are dead. Since Rachel already has Jarahami's DNA, this only necessitates that one more of them morph Ket Halpak. Tobias volunteers, revealing to the Animorphs that he has his morphing ability back, and that the Elemist betrayed him. The Animorphs commiserate with him a bit as he morphs to Ket, and Rachel makes a disparaging remark about the Elemist, and Tobias doesn't really appreciate this. Her anger just makes him angry, and a predator is never angry, only hungry. But Tobias is the one to blame for the Elemist's anger. The Elemist didn't mislead him. If anything, Tobias was vague with the Elemist and then misportrayed their conversation to the rest of the Animorphs. The Animorphs' expectations are more Tobias's fault than they are the Elemist's. Tobias rejects their pity, like always, but maybe there's something more than a desire for self-sufficiency behind it this time. It seems like Tobias may also be trying to protect himself from the knowledge that he never directly asked the Elemist to make him human again, or the greater truth that he doesn't truly want to be human again. Before they kick off their plan, which hasn't been explained to us in full yet, Rachel asks Tobias if he's okay, and he tells her, "I'm a freak of nature, Rachel. Any day I stay alive is a good day for me." Because Tobias is actually participating in this mission, Jake is in Falcon Morph, and he's been given the duty of protecting them and guiding them from the sky, Tobias' usual job, and he's notably worse at this than Tobias is. Tobias and Rachel encounter some taxons, and the brief is for them to allow the taxons to see them and to chase them and alert the Yeerk forces. When they get close though, Tobias is struck with a murderous rage. He really wants to do some damage to these taxons. Rachel interprets this as misplaced anger at the Elemist, but in reality I think Tobias' anger is likely also driven by frustration with himself. He either doesn't know or hasn't fully come to terms with what he actually wanted in the first place, and that sustained level of ambivalence is taking its toll on him. He manages to control himself, and the taxons see them and give chase. As Tobias and Rachel run through the woods, the increasingly large Yeerk force is following them, and they're quickly losing ground because they need to be cutting through all of the foliage and trees, but the Yeerks are just able to follow the path that they've already cut. They plead with Jake to find them a better route to their destination, but Jake is unaccustomed to the role of being in the sky and has a lot of trouble with it. Tobias gives him some tips even as he's escaping on what he should be looking for, and Jake is able to locate a gully that they'll be able to travel at to get to their destination. This winds up working, and they enter the gully and they run along it until they exit a few hundred feet away from their destination, which is a deep ravine. So there are Yeerk forces behind them, and this fire is in front of them, and their only escape route is through this ravine, but it's a sheer 100+ foot drop over the edge of it. Additionally, there's a small platoon of Hork-Bajir in between them and the ravine that they're going to need to fight through to get to it. And this is going to be a tough fight because there's only 2 of them. So they battle it out with these Hork-Bajir, and Tobias is very nearly killed, but Jake saves his life at the last moment. And I thought that this was a pretty poetic moment as it kind of validates Tobias' value to the team, both by showing Jake's shortcomings earlier as a guide, but also by showing how essential it can be to have someone who can just swoop down and strike at a moment's notice. They don't just stick Tobias in the sky because they have nothing better to do with him. They need someone up there, and Tobias is best at it. So as Tobias gets to his feet, the rest of the Yeerk forces emerge from the woods and are closing in on them, and it's time to execute the plan. Rachel does a flying leap off the cliff into the abyss, and Tobias gears up to follow her when Visser 3 emerges from the woods and blocks his way. Tobias decides that the best way to do this is just to plow ahead and maybe he can take the Visser with him. So they engage in a game of chicken, and the Visser jumps out of the way at the last moment, and with a shout of Jarahami and Ket Halpak free, Tobias throws himself off the cliff. As he falls, he's caught by Marco, who's in Gorilla Morph, and he's in this cave that's in the cliff wall, just a short distance beneath the precipice. Rachel's in this cave too, and Marco has saved both of them. And they look in the valley down below them, and they see the 2 free Hork-Bajir, and they're laying on the ground playing dead, and Cassie and Jake, who have morphed wolves, are now down there pretending to eat them. And Visser 3 above them goes up to the edge of this precipice, and they hear him in their heads, telling all of the Yeerks to go and have their host bodies look at these Hork-Bajir dead on the ground, that the wolves will give them a fitting burial, and that this is what happens to anyone who tries to escape from the mighty Yeerks. So after the Yeerks depart, the Animorphs and the free Hork-Bajir find the Elemist's Garden of Eden. The Hork-Bajir tell the Animorphs that they plan to make some Hork-Bajir babies there. And everyone leaves with Tobias hanging back to help them scope out their new territory before flying home. The next day, Rachel comes to Tobias's meadow to look for him, but he hides from her and he ignores her calls. He doesn't want to deal with the pity, the commiseration, any of the feelings that he's had about what's happened. As is his habit, Tobias uses the hawk's cold, predatory mind to protect himself from his human feelings. In a way, this is similar to the encounter, when Tobias reverted to full hawk mode after his attempt at self-harm in the mall. After Rachel leaves, Tobias goes back to trailing the Yeerks, looking for Yeerk pool entrances. Routine is his friend right now. Axe visits him, but Tobias is standoffish, and Axe gets the picture and quickly leaves. Tobias stays on his branch and he's thinking about the warm, golden, fuzzy life that he once had. And as he's thinking about it, he realizes that he never really did have that warm, fuzzy life that he's imagining. And he can honestly admit to himself now that his human life sucked. But that shouldn't mean that he has to spend the rest of his life trapped as a bird, should it? He remembers the half-bird, half-boy form he took when he met the Elemist. In that strange space, he was a hawk and a human at the same time. He brushes the memory off as an Elemist trick and closes his eyes to sleep. When Tobias opens his eyes, he's no longer in his tree. He's in a bedroom, his human bedroom, and there's someone asleep on the bed. It's Tobias of a few months ago, pre-Elfangor Tobias, who is fully human in body and mind and spirit, at least as far as we know so far. He sees a calendar on the wall and he notes that it's actually the night before their trip to the construction site where they're going to meet Elfangor and see him get killed by Visser III. On the bed, human Tobias wakes up and Tobias talks to him, and he deliberates what to tell his former self, noting, "I had forgotten this dream. Hadn't I?" He tells his former self to go to the construction site with Jake the following day, and he laughs to himself as he says it. Why would he do something to ensure that his life would end up the way that it has? Looking at his human self, Tobias realizes that the person that he sees is not who Tobias is now, internally or externally. Regardless of what body he has, meeting Elfangor has changed him. The fight has changed him. He tells human Tobias that he'll help him sleep, and he lands on his arm and starts to acquire him. When he's done, he wakes up in his tree and he hears the Elemist's voice in his head say, "Don't forget, 2 hours, Tobias. Have I kept my promise?" And Tobias says yes, and the Elemist says, "Are you happy, Tobias?" Tobias doesn't answer, and the chapter ends there. And the next day, Rachel is at her Packard Award, and Tobias morphs human and surprises her. And then the book ends. I absolutely loved the ending of this book. The scene in Tobias's human bedroom really destroyed me as a kid. I remember reading it 4 or 5 times over when I first encountered it. The Elemist, will remember, always offers the same thing, a choice. In this case, it's actually 2 choices. Tobias had the option of warning his past self not to go to the construction site and preventing all of the events that turned him into an Animorph in the first place, and he chose not to. And now Tobias is left with the constant choice of becoming human again permanently and giving up his Animorph life. He can morph a human and stay a human for 2 hours, and then he will be a human again. Tobias, for his part, had the wisdom not to ask for something that he wasn't certain he wanted. I'm enthralled by the idea that present-day Tobias may even remember this dream that he had. Fixed-loop time travel has always been one of my favorite plot devices. Tobias's decision to take this action, ensuring that his past self goes down the same path that he did, is representative of a few things. First, obviously, Tobias has reached a state of self-acceptance far beyond anything that he was able to reach in the books so far. He's beyond even his ability to analyze his status without feeling too much pain. He's now able to appreciate who he's become. He's able to even live a life where he has the ability to change back and stay human forever, dangled in front of him day after day without it causing him any distress, because he's that secure in what he is now. The second thing that this choice represents is that his life now is about much more than what physical body he inhabits, and his change is about much more than his physical transformation into a hawk. He is a different person because he met Elfangor, and because of his experiences in the war. Even if he went back to being a full human again, even if he allowed himself to be trapped in his human morph, he still would be a different person because of all of the events that have happened. As the Elemist has given him the ability to choose, Tobias wants to give his past self that same ability, knowing full well what he will choose and knowing full well the consequences that will follow. And there's something really beautiful about that. I also love the Elemist's personal interest in Tobias. Tobias was always my favorite Animorph because he was always a little bit different from the rest of the crew. A loner as a human, a Nothlit as an Animorph. If the Animorphs are all chosen ones in this fiction, Tobias definitely is the chosen one of the Animorphs, notwithstanding Jake's role as leader. We'll find out later in the series that there are very real reasons for this, reasons that I'll be covering in my next video. So let's take a step back and take stock of how far we've come. Tobias started this series as a social outcast, bully magnet, teenage boy with no support and few prospects. He met Elfangor and he poured all of his purpose and conviction into the fight against the Yeerks, only to promptly be trapped in a Hork-Bajir. He has some degree of denial about this at first, gradually coming to accept it after a great deal of inner turmoil and hardship, and then spends a bunch of time trying to get used to his Hawk life and finding his place in the fight against the Yeerks without being able to morph. And he seems to be doing alright at this, only to have it all completely turned on its head when he's not only given the morphing power back, but given a copy of his human DNA as well. Now he can be fully human at any time and will get to grapple with that temptation while he navigates his new life as a morph-capable, red-tailed hawk Animorph in the war against the Yeerks. And we still don't know why he has all of this mysterious Chosen One energy. We don't know why he stayed back to talk to Elfangor. We don't know about this secret connection that they have, or why Axe is so drawn to him. There's a reason that I chose to start my Animorphs videos with this arc, and it is because this story is awesome. I could talk for hours about how much I love the way that this book ended, but I think I've covered everything and we'll be getting into redundancy, so I'm gonna end the video here. Thank you so much for watching, and for those of you who left comments with feedback, I really appreciate it. Please continue to leave them. I have incorporated some of your feedback into this video. I haven't incorporated all of it just because I want to be able to at least maintain some level of baseline and be able to tell if what I'm moving and changing is working or making a difference in the overall production quality. But please continue to let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. If you want to talk about Animorphs, also please leave a comment. I love talking about Animorphs, in case you can't tell. Thank you guys. See you soon.